Welcome to the 11th episode of our show, Pakistan, a hard country, where we delve into the complex realities of Pakistan through the lens of Anatol Lieven's thought-provoking book.
Today we're undertaking a deep dive into the 10th chapter, the Pathans, specifically examining pages 330 to 338.
Right. Our goal is to really grasp the nuances of Pathan identity, their intricate relationship with both Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the historical forces that continue to shape their present circumstances, all informed by Lieven's insightful analysis.
Definitely. Lieven's work is our main guide here.
Okay, let's unpack the Pathans. Right away, Lieven emphasizes a very strong sense of ethnic identity. But here's where a key tension emerges. This strong feeling of being Pathan often exists alongside and sometimes competes with deep-seated tribal loyalties.
Right, these really powerful allegiances. And what's interesting to consider here is how this interplay between, ethnic identity and tribalism impacts the development of broader nationalism.
How so?
Well, Lieven draws a fascinating parallel with the Somalis, suggesting that in both contexts, powerful tribal structures, coupled with imposed geographical divisions like the Durand Line, have historically made it difficult for a unified, modern national identity to fully coalesce.
That makes sense. Thinking back to Lieven's earlier points, the new Pakistani state was already juggling diverse ethnic groups.
Exactly. So this internal dynamic within the Pathan community adds a significant layer to that challenge. Is it about resources, maybe? Or differing ideas of what being Pathan means? Or even just old historical conflicts between tribes? It's probably a mix of all those things.
Yeah, probably. And that brings us nicely to the Durand Line, which is, well, it's far more than just a line on a map, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Lieven makes it really clear that while this border, drawn by the British back in the 1890s, formally separated the Pathan tribes from Afghanistan, the tribes themselves have historically never truly recognized it as a legitimate international boundary.
He even points to that British report from 1901 on Waziristan.
Right, which supports this perspective, really highlighting the tribal viewpoint. So for many Pathans, these aren't seen as two distinct nations in the way, say, a Western understanding of borders might suggest.
Exactly. Lieven kind of prompts you to think about what borders and identity even mean in a context like this. For the Pathans, often their tribal connections mattered more than this line drawn by outsiders.
And this lack of recognition has had huge historical ramifications, right? Particularly in those tribal areas right on the border with Afghanistan.
For sure. As Lieven points out, these areas have been a recurring center for armed Islamist movements, not just recently, post 9/11, but way back during British colonial rule, too.
So it really raises questions about how external rules can clash with these, deeply rooted local identities and loyalties.
Definitely. And this recurring theme of resistance really stands out when you look at Pathan history.
Yeah, Lieven points to those significant tribal jihads in Swat and Chitral in the late 19th century against the British. It paints a picture of a people fiercely protective of their autonomy.
A long history there.
But what I found particularly interesting was his mention of Syed Ahmed Barelvi and his followers way back in the early 19th century. These were figures from outside the immediate Pathan areas who deliberately moved into these tribal regions to wage jihad. Why there, specifically?
Well, Lieven's analysis points to a couple of key factors. First, the relative absence of strong central government control in the Pathan tribal areas basically provided a sanctuary, a safe haven for these early jihadists.
Okay, that makes sense. Less oversight.
Right. But just as important, Lieven suggests, was the reputation and likely the reality of the Pathan tribes as highly capable fighters. They were seen as ideal recruits for such a movement.
And if you connect this to later events, as Lieven does, it serves as a stark historical precedent.
For figures like Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda showing up in the same region centuries later.
Absolutely.
That pattern of external jihadists seeking refuge and finding recruits in the less governed Pathan tribal lands is, well, it's historically significant, to say the least.
So let's shift focus a bit to the more contemporary political landscape within the Pathan areas of Pakistan. Lieven identifies the Awami National Party, the ANP, and the Jamiat-e-Ulema-Islam, the JUI, as the two primary political forces.
The main players, yeah.
Now, the ANP, despite its significance, has faced its share of challenges, hasn't it? Lieven mentions internal divisions and this ongoing struggle to keep voter loyalty, especially with the rise of the Taliban. It sounds like a very complex dynamic.
It is, absolutely. The rise of the Taliban presented a unique kind of dilemma for established Pathan nationalist parties like the ANP,
How so?
because for some Pathans, the Taliban's rise, even with its radical Islamist ideology, might have initially looked like another form of Pathan power asserting itself regionally.
Ah, okay. A sort of distorted expression of nationalism.
Perhaps for some.
Yeah.
And this created tension within Pathan politics, forcing parties like the ANP to tread very carefully in how they related to this new, powerful force. Those internal divisions Lieven mentions likely stemmed, at least partly, from arguments over how best to respond.
And then we have the JUI. Lieven highlights that, unlike the ANP, the JUI's origins actually lie outside the immediate Pathan region, rooted in the Deobandi tradition.
That's right, originating in India.
Yet they've managed to establish a really substantial presence in the frontier. He even points to their historical role, being part of the pro-Pakistan wing of the Jamiat-e-Ulema-e-Hind during British rule. That history adds another layer, doesn't it?
It does. For you, what's key to understanding their success in this region, given those external origins?
Well, what Lieven seems to suggest is that the JUI's ability to get a strong foothold, despite not being ethnically Pathan originally, speaks to the power of religious identity and the specific appeal of their Deobandi ideology for certain parts of the population.
Right. The Deobandi tradition is a major Islamic revivalist movement, quite influential.
And given the often weaker government presence in the tribal areas, the JUI, with its network of madrasas and scholars, was kind of well-placed to fill an ideological and social gap, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, they could exert considerable influence that way.
Now, Lieven gets into a particularly sensitive area, the Muttahida Majlis Iamal, or MMA, alliance, where the JUI was a major player.
Yes, that coalition.
He notes the criticism it faced for its, let's say, ambiguous relationship with more radical elements that later formed the Pakistani Taliban.
It was heavily criticized, yeah.
And while the JUI did condemn the Red Mosque incident in 2007, which is important,
A public condemnation, yes.
Lieven also mentions reports of their private links to certain Taliban factions. It paints a picture of a very delicate, maybe even precarious, political balancing act.
That's a crucial observation by Lieven. The MMA's experience really highlights the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of Islamist politics in Pakistan.
I mean,
While publicly distancing themselves from the most extreme militants while maybe keeping some quiet contact, it could be seen as a way to try and keep some influence, maybe gather intel, or just hedge their bets politically in a volatile situation.
but that ambiguity had consequences.
Oh, definitely. As Lieven implies, this perceived ambiguity likely damaged their public standing and raised serious questions about where they really stood on militancy.
Okay, let's widen the lens now. Lieven then looks at the broader geopolitical picture, Pakistan's long relationship with Afghanistan.
Always crucial.
He reminds us that Pakistan historically supported Islamist groups in Afghanistan, first against the Soviets, and later to prevent what they saw as potential Indian encirclement.
A long-standing policy concern?
And here's an interesting detail. Pakistan's preferred group in Afghanistan, at least until the Taliban rose, was actually Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami.
Right, which was both radical Islamist and predominantly ethnic Pathan.
What does that specific preference tell us about Pakistan's strategic thinking back then?
Well, what Lieven brings out is the strategic calculation behind Pakistan's Afghanistan policy for years. Supporting Islamist groups, even radical ones, was seen as serving Pakistan's core national security interests in a really unstable, vital region.
And a Pathan connection.
The preference for an ethnic Pathan group, like Hezb-e-Islami, is telling. It suggests they understood the importance of ethnic dynamics in Afghanistan and saw potential in leveraging those connections across the Durand Line to gain influence.
And then the Taliban emerged. Lieven points out that Pakistan's initial view of the Taliban's rise and early success in Afghanistan was partly shaped by wanting a friendly government in Kabul.
Securing their western border.
He even traces this strategy back to General Babar under Benazir Bhutto's government, and notes it continued under Pervez Musharraf, despite Musharraf's more modernizing image.
Yeah, it seems like a pragmatic approach maybe, though perhaps ultimately flawed, aimed at regional security.
Indeed. The basic strategic idea, as Lieven lays it out, was that a Taliban-run Afghanistan, with its strong Pathan element, would be less open to Indian influence and could give Pakistan more strategic depth.
And what's striking, as Lieven emphasizes, is how this goal seemed to cut across political divides in Pakistan, staying consistent across different governments.
But as we know now, that strategy had major unintended consequences.
Tragic ones, yes. including fueling militancy back inside Pakistan itself.
So, pulling all this together, what are the key takeaways for understanding Pakistan today, even just from this focused look at Lieven's analysis of the Pathans?
Well, it's clear we're looking at a region defined by this powerful ethnic identity that's constantly interacting with deep tribal
All
loyalties.
right, and there's that long history of resisting outside powers and a political scene heavily influenced by both national parties and religious movements.
And you can't ignore that enduring connection to jihadist movements, plus the crucial geopolitical location right next to Afghanistan. These things continue to shape the challenges Pakistan faces.
Precisely. This deep dive into the Pathans using Lieven's insights, it really leaves you with a crucial question to think about. How do these deeply embedded tribal structures and these long historical experiences continue to shape Pakistan's internal stability and its very complicated relationship with Afghanistan here in the 21st century?
It's a thread that remains incredibly relevant, absolutely essential for really getting to grips with the ongoing complexities of this hard country.